Thank you, Madam Speaker. It's an honor for me to be able to rise today and speak this afternoon on the amendments to the Federal Sustainable Development Act. The concept of sustainable development isn't a new one in Canada. There have been many reports and bills on this. The first one on sustainable development was in 1995 with amendments brought forward by the Auditor General to create the position of the Commissioner of the Environment within the Auditor General's office.
It's on the books for some time that makes sustainable development a goal of the Government of Canada. And as I mentioned, since 1995 in the Auditor General Act, we have had a Commissioner for Environment and Sustainable Development to review government policies. We've also had federal sustainable development strategies, and since 2008, we have had this law, the Federal Sustainable Development Act. Canada has a long engagement with the term sustainable development. I want to just retrace those steps briefly. The term sustainable development was first used in 1987 in the report of the World Commission on Environment and Development. This report was generally referred to as the Brundtland Report because it was a World Commission of primarily people who had had some role in political life. Gro Harlem Brundtland at the time was Prime Minister of Norway, which gave this particular UN effort quite a lot of prestige. She started out actually as chair of the World Commission on Environment and Development as leader of the opposition party in Norway. And quite extraordinarily, she stayed committed to this process. When the government fell, she became Prime Minister of Norway and continued as chair of the process. It had two notable Canadians who participated in this process. One was the Canadian member of the Commission itself, Maurice Strong, whom I met at the time in the late 1980s when I was working for the Minister of Environment. And the federal government of Canada at that time, under the leadership of former Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, played a significant role in helping to fund the work of the Brundtland Commission. But more significantly, in terms of the creation of the term sustainable development, the man who held the pen in writing Our Common Future, the report of the Brundtland Commission, became one of my very best friends. He passed away a little more than a year ago. Jim McNeill, who was Secretary General to the World Commission on Environment Development, is the only person I know to have written a best-selling book without his name on the cover. Our Common Future sold in many languages, sold around the world, and put in place the goal that in order to ensure that those countries and those peoples, including within Canada, who live in poverty, can be raised out of poverty, and at the same time we can limit the damage done by a consumeristic, industrialized society in destroying our environment, we needed to ensure that we developed to lift people out of poverty, but we do it in a way that didn't destroy the life chances of peoples around the world and particularly future generations. I want to note that the goals of the Sustainable Development Strategies as put forward by the Brundtland Commission rested on three legs, not two. It was not merely environment and development, but environment, development, and peace, to which the Brundtland Report directed its attention. It called for a limiting of military spending, attention to the needs to end wars, and to end the environmental damage of the military-industrial complex. By the time the Brundtland Commission report went to the United Nations General Assembly, the goals of peace and nonviolence and ending military spending were set aside. But it was the Brundtland Commission report's recommendations around sustainability that led to the Rio Earth Summit in 1992, the acceptance of the Framework Convention on Climate Change, our entire agenda on fighting global warming by reducing greenhouse gases, can all be traced back to this document from 1987, written by Jim McNeill and endorsed by world leaders. The term sustainable development in the Brundtland Commission report is the one that more or less appears in Bill C-57. There were a number of definitions, in fairness, within the Brundtland Commission report, Our Common Future, but the one that seemed to achieve the most salience was, and it appears in somewhat changed form as a principle within a number of principles in this revised act, le principe selon lequel
the principle of sustainable development being based on rational use of natural resources, social resources, and economic resources, and the necessity on the part of the Government of Canada to make any decisions based on environmental, economic, and social factors.
As you can see from the Brundtland definition, which was that sustainability and sustainable development required that the current generation develop in ways that didn't jeopardize the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So the intergenerational equity piece was very strong. Intergenerational equity then appears in the second part of Principle 5 under this Act, that is important to meet the needs of present generations without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So in taking this forward, the Act is broken apart in two pieces, but I don't think it's done damage to the concept. The principle of sustainable development was taken forward by the Government of Canada, and we became one of the leaders of the world in operationalizing the Brundtland Commission report when we put in place the National Round Table for Environment and Economy. This was the primary mechanism of the Government of Canada in ensuring sustainability. It was brought in under former Prime Minister Brian Mulroney. The act on which it was based was repealed in Bill C-38 in the spring of 2012 in the Omnibus Budget Bill, bulldozed through by former Prime Minister Stephen Harper. I don't know how many people even remember that that's how the National Roundtable on Environment and Economy was eliminated, because that bill touched over 70 different laws and ran to over 400 pages. So people could be forgiven for forgetting the various pieces and how they bulldozed forward. This piece of legislation comes at a good time. We just received, on the
3rd of October 2017, the recent report on the part of Julie Galfin, who is currently the Commissioner of the Environment in the Office of the Auditor General, came out. She put out a very serious report. She said that it is clear that the current government, like past governments, stands no chance whatsoever of achieving targets that were set to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. She said quite clearly that climate change is one of the greatest issues of the 21st century, and it will require a global approach on the part of governments. Now is the time to move from planning to acting. So it is clear now that time is pressing, and the government and everyone actually all over the world are now in a situation that is urgent. Climate change now becomes more serious every single day. And we don't have that action happening. We haven't acted, and we're not acting to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We have plans, and I think the will is there. I think that the current government is willing to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but it is clear, according to the Commissioner of the Environment, that we're not acting enough.
Development strategy that was working, that touched all aspects of government, we would have a response to the single greatest threat to our future in climate change. This bill, and I support this bill, creates an opportunity that perhaps is more significant than members in this place realize as we debate this bill and take it forward to committee. The opportunity is here And based, again, I want to thank the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Environment and Sustainable Development for its report in June of 2016. Most of the committee's recommendations, and the recommendations were unanimous, most of the committee's recommendations are coming forward in this bill. I will pause to note some that are not. But the committee did good work, having heard from many witnesses. One witness, I have to say, who's I'm very proud to say is one of my constituents, one of Canada's leading experts in environment and sustainable development, Professor David Boyd, described the current bill as a disaster. Well, I want to go back and say, as I did in earlier questions and comments, that the Sustainable Development Bill that came forward in 2008 was based on a private member's bill from a member of the opposition, a Liberal member of Parliament, a former cabinet minister in the government of the former Prime Minister Paul Martin, and a very dedicated parliamentarian, very committed to climate action, and a dear friend of mine. So I mean no criticism of the Honourable John Godfrey when I say that the current bill is too weak. He had to get a private member's bill, imagine this, in 2007, in the time of a minority parliament where the Prime Minister was Stephen Harper, the Minister of Environment was the Honourable John Baird, and there was tremendous cooperation to get this bill through before John Godfrey resigned from Parliament. It was a tremendous effort. It was a success. We got a Sustainable Development Act, but it did not call on the government to adopt a whole-of-government approach. The strategies around sustainable development were essentially environment strategies. And even on that, Madam Speaker, I wanted to share with members of this place who may not know it. Every member of this place is being told, get your Christmas card designs into the House of Commons print shop now, and you will get free Christmas cards to send to all your constituents. I just want to warn you right now that you will not be able to get them on recycled paper. Now, you would think that having had a Sustainable Development Strategy Act since 2008, something as basic as the Parliament of Canada should have Christmas cards on 100% post-consumer waste card stock would not be a current issue of concern. So I hate to tell you all, but if you order your Christmas cards through the free available Christmas card stock, ce n'est pas le papier.
This is not recycled paper. It is new paper with no recycled content.
Would rather have our Christmas cards go out on recycled paper. That's a basic. It's a basic thing, I think, as well, that the parliamentary dining room should serve seafood that doesn't come from endangered species and doesn't contaminate coastal waters because it's farmed salmon. I've tried. I've written to the Board of Internal Economy. I've written to the Speaker. I've tried over the years to figure out how to control the decision-making in the wonderful staff, terrific parliamentary dining room. The chef is wonderful, and I don't mean to criticize, but they don't have the scope to ensure that they can spend the money to bring parliamentarians and their guests ethical seafood. It's not ethical. You have to be very careful when you're looking at the menu. So these are basics, one would think, having had a sustainable development strategy for the Government of Canada since 2008. I don't think Canadians would be surprised to find that it hadn't radically reformed our attitude towards fossil fuels. You might have hoped it could do the little stuff. Recycled paper for Christmas cards, ethical seafood in our dining room, not leaving cars idling outside Parliament Hill. That was a rule, by the way, Madam Speaker, put in place by former Speaker John Fraser when he was Speaker of the House in a document called Greening of the Hill, in which he required recycled paper, no idling of cars, no use of pesticides on our lawns. That one is still in place. So, to continue, Madam Speaker, what this bill does, I hope, will ensure that the little stuff gets done. But more than that, it's my hope that some of the large goals can be achieved based on the changes in this Act. What are the places where we are looking at sustainable development right now globally in 2017? Our biggest challenge are the Sustainable Development Goals that were adopted by the United Nations in September 2015. There are 17 Sustainable Development Goals, Madam Speaker, and they have within them 169 specific targets to be achieved by 2030. They include such things as taking care of our oceans and a specific goal, stopping the dumping of plastics in our oceans. It includes eliminating poverty. It includes education for women and girls. These are broad and critical sustainable development goals, all 17 of them. And they apply domestically to industrialized countries just as they apply globally and create pressure for industrialized countries to do more in overseas development assistance to lift all peoples of this planet out of poverty. We can do it. We have the resources to do it. That's a sustainable development goal. I should also mention rights of Indigenous peoples. In the Brundtland Report, in Our Common Future, it's very clear that an essential aspect of sustainable development is rights of self-determination to Indigenous peoples. So I would submit to this House that the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is part and parcel of the Sustainable Development Goals and what are now called the SDGs of the United Nations system. So now let me return to Bill C-57 that we're debating. I like this purpose. The purpose language under the Act is to provide a legal framework for developing and implementing a federal sustainable development strategy, making decision-making, I'm paraphrasing, more transparent, subject to accountability of Parliament. But here again I quote, promotes coordinated action across the Government of Canada to advance sustainable development and respects Canada's domestic and international obligations relating to sustainable development with a view to improving the quality of life of Canadians. The international piece is important here too. I don't think there's a single department of the Government of Canada that will not find itself challenged to take these principles, now including openness and transparency, Indigenous engagement, intergenerational equity, social, economic, and environmental sustainability, to take them on board seriously and develop a strategy and report to Parliament. These are all positive changes. There is one change that I find problematic, and that's the deletion of the requirement under the previous Act of regulation of performance-based contracts. This is found in Section 12 of the Act as it exists right now, that performance-based contracts with the Government of Canada shall include, that's mandatory language, provisions for meeting applicable targets referred to in Federal Sustainable Development Strategy. Now, the Parliamentary Committee makes a reference to the performance-based contracts, but does not suggest that clause be deleted. It suggests it be given more specificity and applied to more entities. So I find it a little disturbing that having done such a good job overall in drafting amendments to C-57, that performance-based contracts are removed, and instead a very, I have to say, well, one of my law professors always used to refer to something like this as having a lot of weasel words. So it's now replaced with Section 10.1, power of the Treasury Board. The Treasury Board may establish policies or issue directives applicable to one or more of the designated entities in relation to the environmental impact of their operations. In other words, that clause is a big fat nothing compared to the performance-based contract clause that exists in the current Act. So I certainly will be taking amendments forward to committee when this bill goes to committee in hopes of preserving the existing Section 12 for performance-based contracts. But overall, Madam Speaker, this bill can't come too soon. Sustainable development has been on the lips of Canadian politicians who didn't have any idea what it really meant for decades now. If we're serious about this, it's about equity. It's about equity between wealthy, industrialized country like Canada and people who are the poorest of the poor living on this planet right now with us, our human family. It's about equity in intergenerational terms, that we don't have the right, and I'm a grandmother, I don't have the right. No one in our baby boom generation that just had a great big party since the end of the Second World War, we don't have the right to leave the ecological damages and ecological debt on our kids' credit cards. We don't have the right to deprive children born today of their access to a healthy and sustainable biosphere, to live out their life without fear of annihilation. We're on the cusp of the last moment that we can save this place. Let's get this act to committee, and let's get a climate change plan underway immediately. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Families, Children and Social Development.
I'd like to commend the member opposite for a very thoughtful and a very wise intervention, and I have a suggestion that some of the ideas that she presented around how government can approach sustainable development with an actual sort of work plan for government itself. The member from Vancouver Quadra is currently engaged in a greening of government exercise, and it'd be great for if you haven't put those specific proposals on paper, recycled paper, it'd be great to have you do that. I have a question, though, about...
And the member to address it through the chair.
The question I have is the following. We are also involved as a country in supporting the Sustainable Development Goals on the international level. And I was wondering what advice the member might have for things we can do practically to support other countries as they too decide to engage in Sustainable Development Goals. And we leave that era of thinking that all progress is good progress, that era of thinking that said, you know, if you build an expressway in downtown Toronto, it's good because it's jobs, even though you destroy the city, wipe out the local economy, pollute the air, and displace low-income populations. A policy, by the way, the CCF supported, curiously enough. But I'm just curious if she has advice for us on what we can do to support other countries as they embrace Sustainable Development Goals.
The Honourable Member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Very briefly, Madam Speaker, I think we should lead by example. They won't believe us if we tell them what to do and we're not doing it. And it's always been very clear that development has to be, we have to treat the earth as a, we have to live off the earth's interest. We can't dig into the capital. We have to recognize that we should only be ensuring that we, in the words of Indigenous peoples, that we are borrowing from our grandchildren, not stealing from them, and that we ensure that what's there as a legacy for future generations is better than the earth that we've received. And frankly, we're doing the opposite.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires. The Honourable Member for Timmins James Bay.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I listen with great interest to my honourable colleague. You know, 5-minute walk from my house is the most beautiful place I know on earth, Cross Lake. And you can't swim in that lake. And you probably can't swim in that lake for another 100 years because it used to be considered completely acceptable to take the toxins from the mine and just dump it in lakes because they were there. And so the environment is recovering, but it's only recovering because of legislation. Nobody did this, made this happen voluntarily. It was legislation. I'd like to ask my honourable colleague about the necessity to ensure that we have strong legislation to protect not just our water, but our air as well.
The Honourable Member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
There's a clear record on this. I thank my friend from Timmins James Bay. When we fought acid rain, we did it with regulations. Eliminating mercury took banning it. Getting lead out of gasoline took regulations. We can do a lot with carrots, but we better not forget our sticks.